I received an absurd bill saying that all residents should pay for the repair of the neighborhood pool. But guess what? I never used the damn thing. When I investigated, I discovered something that made even the most passive neighbors revolt against the HOA. The HOA in my neighborhood had always been a cesspool of nonsensical rules, absurd fees, and ridiculous requirements. But until then, I had managed to live my life without any major problems. I paid the mandatory fees, kept my house up to code, and ignored the pointless meetings where half a dozen neighbors thought they were the mayor of the city. I just wanted peace. But of course, that wasn't going to last. It all started when I opened my mailbox and found an envelope from the HOA. I thought it was just another one of those boring letters about tree trimming or some ridiculous new rule that nobody asked for. But when I opened it and saw the amount of the charge, I almost fell over backwards. $2,500. I blinked a few times, trying to figure out if I was reading it right. The description read, "Community Pool Repair Contribution Fee." I laughed. It had to be a mistake, because I have never used that pool. Not once. Not when I moved in. Not when the summer was scorching. Not even when friends came to visit and asked if there was a pool in the neighborhood. Never. In fact, I barely remembered that the damn pool existed. It was in a common area of the neighborhood, surrounded by a locked gate with a code that only those who frequented it knew. I never bothered to ask for that code because, honestly, who cares? I have my own yard, my own air conditioning, and more interesting things to do than share chlorine with screaming children and middle-aged men complaining about the government. But now, apparently, I was responsible for fixing a hole in the bottom of the pool and replacing the filtration system. I looked at the bill one more time, hoping that it would suddenly turn into a smaller number, something that made sense. But no, the $2,500 were still there, staring at me, as if they were laughing in my face. I picked up the phone and called the HOA office, feeling my blood rise. After a few rings, a woman answered with that monotonous tone of someone who is clearly used to hearing complaints all day long. I explained that I had received the charge and wanted to understand how something like this could be approved without any prior warning. Unsurprisingly, she replied that the Community Maintenance Fund had decided that repairs to the pool should be shared equally between the residents. I insisted, asking how exactly this decision was made. Then came the most ridiculous answer of all. The decision was approved at an HOA meeting, where 5 or 6 people were present. Yes, half a dozen neighbors, probably the same ones who use that pool every week, decided that we would all have to pay. I closed my eyes for a second, trying not to laugh out loud. The HOA has always used this trick. They hold meetings at impossible times, where no one can attend, and make decisions that affect everyone. Then they send the bill without warning, and hope no one questions it. But I was going to. I thanked them dryly and hung up. I then went straight to the HOA's website to find any document or rule that would justify this charge. I spent an hour reading vague regulations, full of complicated terms, but I couldn't find anything that gave the HOA the power to charge this amount the way they did. So I went to check the HOA's finances. They are obliged to release annual spending reports, but, as expected, the figures didn't add up. The pool had last been serviced 3 years ago at a much lower cost. Now, out of the blue, they were charging a fortune. The situation was clear. Either they were overcharging for the service, or the money was going into a specific pocket. I knew that if I ignored it, they wouldn't give up. First came friendly reminders, then formal notifications. And if I continued to refuse to pay, they would try to put a lien on my house, making it impossible to sell the property in the future without paying off this absurd debt. The HOA was basically a mafia dressed up as a community committee, and I knew that most people simply paid up to avoid a headache. But not me. If they thought they could stick me with this unexplained charge, they were about to find out that they picked the wrong person to scam. After hanging up the phone with the HOA, my irritation only grew. I knew it didn't make any sense for a $2,500 charge to just appear without warning, and even worse, to be approved by 5 or 6 people who were clearly only looking out for their own interests. But the big question was, where was this money going? I had already found inconsistencies in the HOA's financial reports. The last pool maintenance was done 3 years ago and cost much less than what they were charging now. If it was just a repair, the figures wouldn't add up. And if it was a complete overhaul, why didn't anyone know about it beforehand? I started to investigate. I contacted some of the neighbors, especially those who, like me, had never used the pool. Their reaction was exactly what I expected. No one had any idea about this charge until the bill appeared. This confirmed one thing for me. This decision was made on purpose, in silence, without most of the residents knowing. The HOA was counting on people's passivity. They sent bills and trusted that the majority would pay without question. After all, who has the time and patience to fight with a neighborhood association? But I wasn't going to let it go. I called a neighbor who used to go to HOA meetings. He was always the patient type, but even he sounded indignant. He said that the meeting where they decided on this charge was held at an unusual time, a weekday at 10 a.m., when most people were at work. The HOA knew exactly what it was doing. But then he said something that made my head explode. He said that, months earlier, the president of the HOA had mentioned that a friend of hers owned a pool maintenance company. In other words, there was a very good chance that this absurd charge was not just overbilling, but a brazen scheme to put money in someone's pocket. I needed proof. I went back to the HOA website and searched for signed contracts with service providers. It took me a while, but I found the name of the company that was supposed to do the pool repairs. The name didn't ring a bell, but a quick internet search revealed a disgusting detail. The company belonged to the husband of the HOA president. Now it all made sense. The HOA forced an absurd charge on all the residents, and the money went straight to a company linked to the president. It was a classic overbilling scam, where they faked an expensive service and diverted some of the money to themselves. I couldn't believe they were trying to pull this off, but now I had something powerful. Proof. I stopped and thought about what the next step would be. I could simply refuse the charge and ignore any fine, but that wouldn't solve the problem. The HOA would continue to exploit the residents as it always had. I needed to make it a big enough problem that they couldn't ignore it, and I already knew exactly how to do that. I took screenshots of everything: the HOA documents, the name of the contractor, the company records showing that it belonged to the president's husband. I took all this and started preparing an email to all the residents of the neighborhood. But before sending it out, I decided to take one last step. I contacted a local reporter who used to cover stories about fraud and abuses of power. I explained the situation, sent the documents, and asked if he would be interested in investigating further. The response was almost immediate. He said that cases like this were more common than people thought, and that if I was willing to give an interview, he could expose the story publicly. The HOA thought it could force me to pay for something I never used. But now, they were about to deal with something much worse: the exposure of their scam to everyone. After gathering all the evidence, I knew it wasn't enough just to refuse to pay the ridiculous charge. If I really wanted to put an end to this tomfoolery, I needed to make it big enough so that the HOA had no way of getting away with it. I sent the email to all the residents, attaching screenshots of the documents and explaining everything: the unjustified charge, the approval made in secret, and, most importantly, the fact that the money was going to the HOA president's husband's company. The effect was instantaneous. Minutes later, my inbox started filling up with replies from outraged neighbors. Some people hadn't even noticed the charge yet, and were outraged to see where the money was going. Others had been furious with the HOA for some time, and finally had a concrete reason to speak out. But the best part was when one of the neighbors responded with something I hadn't expected. He had worked in the maintenance department and knew exactly how much repairs to pools like that cost. According to him, The real cost of the service was nowhere near $2,500 per house. At best, the total cost of the renovation wouldn't exceed $30,000. But the way the HOA organized the billing, they were collecting more than $250,000 from the residents. This confirmed what I already suspected. It was a blatant overbilling scam. The next step was to make sure this information reached more people. The reporter I had contacted replied the next day, saying that the story sounded interesting enough to investigate. He asked to set up a conversation, and, after a few minutes on the phone, it was clear that he wanted to take it to local TV. The guy knew that stories of fraud in housing associations always attracted attention. And this wasn't just an unfair charge, it was a case of explicit corruption within a community. Meanwhile, inside the neighborhood, the situation began to spiral out of the HOA's control. The email I sent made a huge splash. Neighbors started organizing and questioning every penny the HOA had collected before. People wanted to know where the money from the fees we paid every year was going, why we never had transparency in the maintenance contracts, and who else was profiting from it. And then came the final blow. A petition began circulating around the neighborhood demanding a full audit of the HOA's finances and the removal of the president and committee members involved in the scam. In less than a day, more than half of the residents had signed it. The HOA, which had always acted as if it were above question, was suddenly cornered. The next morning, I received an official email from the HOA. They claimed that the information I had disclosed was false, and that they were considering legal action against defamation. Typical. It was their last card, to intimidate me into giving up the fight. But what they didn't know was that the story about the scandal was about to be aired. And when it did, there would be nowhere else to run. The HOA's desperate response trying to accuse me of defamation confirmed two things for me. Firstly, they were scared. Secondly, they knew that what I did was enough to ruin everything. The pool scandal story was about to air, and now the entire community was aware of what was going on. The email I sent to the neighbors had an effect. Word of mouth spread, and soon even those who normally ignored the HOA's problems began to realize that they weren't just enforcing boring rules. They were blatantly stealing. The problem for the HOA was that, for the first time, they weren't in control. The petition for a full audit of the finances grew fast. Nobody wanted to pay for a pool they never used, let alone line the pockets of the president and her husband. Within days, almost everyone in the neighborhood had signed it. The HOA's situation was deteriorating rapidly. Even residents who had previously supported the rules began to question the transparency of the administration. If they were overcharging for a pool repair, what else could they be embezzling without anyone noticing? Tension in the neighborhood grew by the day. Some people started going to the HOA's headquarters to demand answers, but the president avoided any confrontation. She didn't answer phone calls, didn't reply to emails, and even stopped leaving the house. The committee, once full of confidence to throw fines and arbitrary rules in residents' faces, was now completely silent. It was in this climate that the story about the scandal finally aired on local TV. The reporter didn't mince his words. He exposed the documents that showed the president's relationship with the contracted company, the inconsistencies in the amounts charged, and the testimonies of outraged residents. The article clearly showed that the HOA was using residents' money to enrich itself at the expense of an invented fee. The icing on the cake was when the reporter tried to interview the president of the HOA. The journalist went to her house, and the camera recorded everything. She refused to leave, closed the curtains, and, when she saw that they weren't leaving, called the police claiming that they were invading her privacy. This only made matters worse. The HOA, which used to be an untouchable entity in the neighborhood, was now seen as a corruption scheme. Residents began to demand not only an audit, but the immediate expulsion of the president and the committee. The HOA's lawyers must have realized that the fight was lost, because the next day I received an email saying that the pool fine had been canceled. It was an obvious move to try to calm the situation, but it was too late. The residents didn't just want the charge to be withdrawn, they wanted justice. And now the HOA was about to suffer a blow from which it would never recover. The HOA tried to put out the fire by canceling the pool charge, but it was too late. The damage was done, and no one trusted them anymore. The whole neighborhood wanted answers, and the pressure only grew. What started out as simple indignation over an unfair charge had now become a collective revolt against years of abuse and corruption. The petition to demand a full audit of the finances had already received enough signatures to force a formal review. The HOA president, who previously handed out arbitrary fines and rules without blinking, now couldn't even leave her house without being confronted by her neighbors. Tension reached a peak when an emergency meeting was called to discuss the future of the association. The community hall, which was usually almost empty at these meetings, was packed. The HOA president was there, but she looked completely different. Her usual arrogant tone was gone. Instead of her usual authoritative posture, she was now visibly uncomfortable, leafing through papers and avoiding eye contact with the residents. She knew the evening would not end well for her. As soon as the meeting started, the avalanche of questions came. Residents wanted to know where the money from the fees was going, who approved the maintenance contracts, and how the decision to charge for the pool was made without public consultation. The HOA tried to defend itself, claiming that everything was done within the rules, but nobody believed it. By then, the TV report had already spread the truth, and the documents proved that the president's husband's company was directly linked to the overbilling for the pool renovation. That's when one of the neighbors, who had experience with accounting, brought up a document that took everyone by surprise. The HOA was accumulating a gigantic reserve fund that was never properly explained. The president began to stutter, trying to justify herself, but there was no way out. Every time she tried to argue, someone brought up another piece of evidence against her. Residents began to demand that she resign immediately. At first, she resisted. She said that she was being attacked unfairly, that it was all just confusion. But no one bought that excuse. The noise in the room grew, and it became clear that if she didn't leave of her own free will, she would be forced out. So she gave in. With a defeated tone, she announced that she was resigning as president of the HOA. The committee, which until then had tried to remain neutral, realized that its reputation had also been destroyed, and all the members resigned soon after. The whole neighborhood erupted in applause. In the following days, the audit confirmed what everyone already knew. The fees had been misappropriated for years. Part of the community funds was being used for administrative expenses without justification, and the overpriced swimming pool contract was just one example of a much larger scheme. Lawyers stepped in, and the case was taken to court. The former HOA president, who had thought herself untouchable for so long, was now dealing with lawsuits for fraud and misappropriation of funds. The new committee formed by the residents began to rewrite the association's rules, ensuring that never again would a scam like this happen. Pointless fines were canceled, and new measures were put in place to ensure that decisions were actually voted on by everyone. And the swimming pool? Well, ironically, after the former president was exposed, no one else made a point of renovating it. It was closed indefinitely. And what about me? I never had to pay a penny of that absurd charge. In the end, I won. So, guys, tell me something. Have you ever had to deal with a corrupt HOA or a standoffish neighbor? Because this story was a real circus. If you've been through something like this, comment below. I want to know how far these crazy things have gone. Has anyone ever faced a scam worse than this absurd pool charge? And hey, if you like this video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because there are a lot of unbelievable stories coming up. Want to see more epic shenanigans? Click on the card now, and let's go to the next video. See you there.